there, and welcome to the Joe Roberts podcast. This is the first podcast that I have made since changing the format of this podcast. It used to be exclusively about differences in sexual development, but I recently made the decision that I'm going to talk about different subjects and just a wider variety of topics. And the first topic that I'm going to talk about, as the title suggests, is anarchy. And specifically in defence of anarchy. And I should say right from the very beginning of this podcast that that doesn't mean that I'm saying that anarchy is perfect. It's simply in defence of anarchy. It's not anarchy is perfect and without any problems or flaws. What motivated me to talk about this subject is that I have been a believer in anarchist principles for pretty much most of my life, most of my adult life, and it's never really gone away. And I thought that it would be interesting to talk about this topic, given that in the UK we're only a matter of days away from a general election, and every time a general election comes up, it tends to sort of become very clear to me exactly how futile and repetitive our political infrastructure is, and just how much it calls for change. And it's not a change which is ever forthcoming. And I generally tend to see the British general public going round and round in circles. And Albert Einstein once said that insanity is doing the same thing over and over again and expecting different results. And the British political system is a textbook example of that. So I'm going to talk a little bit about anarchy in this podcast. Also, given the enormity of the topic, I may very well have to split this podcast into two different parts. So first off, I want to talk a little bit about how I feel that the current political system in the UK is futile. So, in the upcoming general election, which will be taking place on the 4th of July 2024 in the UK, there are 6 main political parties who are the sort of front runners in that election. Now, there's other political parties that you can vote for, but they're very small ones, which most people haven't heard of and hardly anybody votes for. But you've got 6 main ones, and I'm going to briefly cover each of these and then explain how all of this adds to the sort of futility of the current British political system. So, first off, you have the Green Party. Their sole focus is the environment, climate change, etc. They're very singular in their viewpoint, and they look at everything through the lens of climate change. And this is why they don't tend to get a huge number of votes, and they have pretty much no chance of winning the election because they're too niche. And that's the thing about niche political parties. Because they're niche, they don't really stand much of a chance of winning the election, because they tend to have an ideological lens for pretty much everything, and it relates to what their party is about. So they're not really a viable candidate in the election. They can increase the amount of influence they have, but that's it. So they're not really a serious contender to win the election. Next up, we have the Scottish Nationalist Party. Again, the same principle applies. They're niche. They have a lens, and everything's viewed through the lens of Scottish independence. And again, this limits their chances. They're not going to win a general election, and their popularity in recent months has plummeted in Scotland owing to corruption. So they're not really a serious contender either. Next, we come to Reform UK. Again, the same principle applies. They have an ideological lens. They view everything through the lens of immigration as a problem. There's almost no chance of them winning the election. The most they can do is increase the number of seats that they have. So that leaves Labour, Conservative and Liberal Democrat. Again, Liberal Democrat have not been a front runner in an election since they formed a coalition with the Tories a number of years ago, and even then they were not really a front runner. They're not really taken seriously enough. They don't tend to have enough strength. and they don't tend to have a high enough number of votes to really wield any serious influence in our society. So again, they're not really a frontrunner either, and it's generally widely accepted that they stand very little chance of winning a general election, which leaves two parties, Labour and Conservative. Now, it's been the case that Labour and Conservative have been the two main political parties in the UK for a very long time, probably somewhere in the region of 100 years, if not more. And our society has basically gone back and forth repeatedly for a very long time now between Labour and Conservative governments. What tends to happen is that you get 3 or 4 terms of one of them. The various different leaders tend to make a mess of things and generally not represent the best interests of the majority of people for a prolonged period of time, and the general population tend to get more and more tired of that party, and then they switch back to the other one, and they just keep doing this over and over again on a loop. We go back and forth between Labour and Conservative. We had in the 90s a very long period where Labour were in power. We got tired of them. We went over to Conservative. We've now had 3 or 4 consecutive Conservative governments. People are now saying that they're tired of them, and it's generally widely accepted that Labour will have a landslide victory in the upcoming election. So it's very repetitive, and you remember the quote from Albert Einstein, insanity is doing the same thing over and over again and expecting different results. So we're essentially a two-party state, and I would actually even debate that, because the next point that I would make as regards the futility of this current political system is that there isn't really a striking enough difference between the Labour and Conservative parties to consider that we have a two-party state. There's very little difference, actually, in terms of policy. Both agree that immigration needs to be lowered. Their differences are not particularly radical. They're generally fairly liberal on some issues. Okay, we have the Conservatives tend to be slightly more conservative on certain issues than the Labour Party, but it's shades of grey. There is not a striking huge difference between the two parties, so you could actually argue that it's as good as a one-party state. So that kind of does away with the idea that we have lots of choice. Which kind of leaves me asking the question, why therefore do the British general public keep going back and forth, or keep going round and round and round in circles? And I've reached a conclusion that it's a case of better the devil you know. If you mention anarchy to most people, they have a certain image in their mind, and that image is the result of a very long smear campaign which has been launched against the word anarchy, which goes back a very long time. And the image that most people get in their mind when you mention the word anarchy is one of civil unrest. Usually people looting and destroying properties and or committing various different crimes. That is the result of a smear campaign, and that is the reason that most people are convinced that better the devil you know is a valid and, worthwhile approach to politics, or how to arrange a society. In actual fact, the misconceptions are not correct. If you look at the actual etymology of the word anarchy, it simply just means without rulers. So it's essentially just a society, a culture, which is run without governments or monarchy. It has nothing to do with civil unrest. Now, people can have their beliefs about whether that would be an inevitable result of not having government or monarchy, and they may or may not be correct, but if you're looking at the actual definition of anarchy and what it's supposed to be, it's just a society which doesn't have rulers. I'm not sure how many examples of anarchist societies there's been throughout history, but I don't think that there are many. So the viewpoint that many people have that civil unrest would be the inevitable result of not having any monarchy or government hasn't really been tried or tested to any vast extent. And also, what I would hasten to point out here is that we do have rulers, we do have governments, we do have monarchies in the world that we currently live in, and there's no shortage of things like war, serious crimes, murders, etc., etc. And you can argue that the fact that we have rulers has prevented unrest or crime or violence to any significant degree, because it hasn't. So the next thing that I want to talk about as regards criticisms of the current political system that we have in comparison to an anarchist society is the features of our current society which everybody complains about but views as some sort of inevitability. These include things such as income tax, corruption in governments, police corruption, police violence, police brutality, monarchy, and various other things. So the first thing that I'm going to come to in that list is work. So the institution of work is one of the main features of a capitalist society, a democracy. And the institution of work is a scenario whereby a person sells their labour, in many cases for a lot less than it's actually worth. They're also selling off their time, their energy, and their focus. And again, in many cases, for a lot less than it's actually worth. And that exists on a sliding scale across our planet. So you've got children in the sort of Far East who sell off their labour for vastly less than what it's worth. You've got adults in the Western world who engage in factory work, something that I once did myself, for a lot less than it's worth. And ironically, factory work is actually the backbone of Western society, and they're some of the lowest paid workers in society. But essentially what I'm saying here is that the whole concept of labour is that you're selling off your labour, your time, your energy, your focus, your attention, in many cases for a lot less than it's actually worth. And there's also a certain element of absurdity to it. So, for example, you can have somebody that's caring for the sick or the elderly and doing a really, really valuable job, who gets paid a very, very low wage, for example, a carer or a nurse, and then you can have somebody that is doing a completely arbitrary and sort of kind of meaningless job, like, for example, a footballer who is paid many, many millions. So it's not like you could say that the labour system, in terms of how it works in Western society, actually has any intrinsic value or logic to it, because in many cases it doesn't at all. Then there is the taxation system, which most people, most sensible, intelligent human beings agree is legalised theft. And the government justifies this on the grounds that they take your money off you and then put it towards things which they feel are necessary, or they tell you are necessary, things which might include defence budgets, war, bombs, guns, which not everybody ideologically agrees with in the first place. They could take your taxes and drive them into a war, or higher salaries for politicians that already receive wages which are vastly higher than that of the average citizen. It's generally regarded with a great deal of animosity by most people in the Western world, the taxation system, and yet people tolerate it and justify it and defend it if you dare to suggest that an anarchist society might be an improvement on democratic society. So it's kind of like a weird kind of Stockholm syndrome, whereby people dislike the actual setup, but they cling to it and defend it anyway, out of little more than better the devil you know. Then we have the institution of government itself, and I can sort of extend that to police as well. And then both institutions kind of operate from, I would say, a very distinct lack of awareness at this point in human evolution. Neither are operating from a place of very high consciousness and awareness, and we can see this in things like corruption and police brutality, and they're generally not operating from a very high level of awareness. And this kind of leads me to an excellent point which I always like to make about this subject. People will make certain criticisms of anarchy, and I always like to say that there's no criticism you could make of the idea of an anarchist society that you couldn't also make about a so-called democracy. You can't very well argue that we as a species are not conscious and aware enough to cope with a lack of leaders, and then make the argument that we are aware enough and highly evolved enough to cope with having a vote and actually having the responsibility of electing leaders and a government. That's kind of a self-defeating argument. So I'm inclined to ask the question, what is it that makes the people that are leading us qualified to do so and fit to do so, and what is it that makes the people that are in the police force fit and qualified to do the job that they're doing? And it's very, very ambiguous. Then we come to monarchy, which is in many respects a profoundly absurd institution. You're sort of going into very specious arguments such as the concept of blue blood, a completely fallacious and fictitious concept. It has absolutely no merit or basis in reality whatsoever. They're just human beings like the rest of us, and yet people defend this absurdity, and in the UK at least, the royal family take money off the taxpayers and have been doing for quite a long time. There is no logical argument in favour of the concept of monarchy. Then finally we come to the concept of money itself. Now this is a very difficult one to explain, but essentially money is a fiction, and this idea of money being a fiction, it refers to the fact that money only has value because people have collectively agreed to give it value. It's not actually backed anymore by any physical commodity like gold. The amount of gold that the banks have in their reserves does not actually cover the amount of so-called money which is in circulation, which increasingly is represented only by numbers on a screen. And it's trust in this system and, belief in this system which keeps it going, and it's sort of held together by illusion. Essentially, money doesn't actually have any value. If you take a banknote, a £20 note, and you read what is on it, it tells you, "I promise to issue the bearer on demand." It's an IOU. It's a promissory. It doesn't have any actual value, and it's just based on mutual agreement, really. And then we get to the entire banking system, and I don't really want to get into this in any great depth because it kind of would justify an entire podcast in and of itself, but to cut a long story short, the banking system is inherently crooked from the ground up. So to summarise, go and research fractional reserve lending and make your own mind up. But to cut a long story short, we have a number of features in a democratic society which are not entirely fair, which are not operating from a place of fairness, from a place of equality, from a place of awareness. And then you get to the point where you have to ask the question, well, how can an anarchist society actually be any worse than that? And I'm going to kind of go into this in greater depth in part 2 of this podcast. In that, I will be sort of going into some of the arguments against anarchy, and I'll be sort of countering them and explaining how a lot of the arguments that are used against anarchy could equally be applied to the current type of society in which we're living. So thank you very much for listening to this podcast. I hope it's been interesting to you. Please like and subscribe, and consider listening to more of my podcasts. Bye for now, and thanks for listening.